Tonight on this special edition of 60 Minutes presents Lucinda Reid Brown, a Clemson University staff member talking about the generations of her family and their experiences at Fort Hill, an insight into the African American history of Clemson University through the eyes of a descendant with details on slavery, religion, and family never revealed before.
Good afternoon, Mrs. Brown. Thank you for joining us here at 60 Minutes. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Mrs. Brown, where were you born?
I was born in the country between Clemson and Central, just a few miles down the road from the university.
Okay. Who were your parents and grandparents?
My parents were Alfred Butler Reid and Polly Reid, and my grandparents were Isaac and Amy Butler.
What do you remember about them?
My mother was a domestic worker, and my father was a field worker, and one's a sharecropper. My grandfather loved to tell me stories when I was young. He told me he used to be a slave for John C. Calhoun, and he worked in the fields, and although it was not easy, the slaves accepted their lives as they were. He remembers that Mr. Calhoun was known as a god among the slaves, and they would try to touch him as he walked by. And I also remember my grandmother, Esther Reid, making coffee and grits in the morning, and she was a domestic sharecropper.
Can you remember older family members talking about earlier times in their lives? Did they talk about slavery?
I remember the older members of my family talking a good bit about slavery, but I can only remember a small amount of what they told me. My aunts, uncles, and grandparents talked about the landowners not allowing slaves to practice religion. Because of this, they would go deep into the woods to worship and hold small services, so the slave owners would not hear them. Although they said that John C. Calhoun was nice to the slaves and sharecroppers for the most part.
Did your family own their own home?
My family lived on the farm at Fort Hill, and my mother lived in the small house next to the mansion, but they did not own their own homes.
Okay, so how did they pay the landowners?
They could not really read and write that much, and because of the lack of education, the landowners had to make it very simple for them to pay.
So where are older family members buried?
Everyone was buried in Abbeville. Nobody had grave markers, though. I don't really think that was a thing, especially for African Americans who worked on the plantations.
Do you remember attending any funerals of your family members?
No, nobody had a funeral.
So do you remember any marriages or weddings of members of your family?
No, nobody had an official wedding in my family. If people lived together, that usually meant that they were married. However, some slave owners did allow formal ceremonies, but not many. And however, I was officially married to my husband, Jack Wallace Brown.
So were there any families that you were related to by marriage?
We were related to the Sloan and Poe families, but that's all I can recall.
Thank you, Mrs. Brown, for sharing your family's past with us. We really appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you for having me. Go Tigers.